Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind Gut Conversation podcast, a place to learn about new ideas from thought leaders in the areas of optimal health, wellness, and the science of mind gut microbiome interactions. Today, I have the great pleasure to speak to Dr. Jennifer Fulcher, who is an associate professor in the Department of Medicine, Division of Infectious Diseases at UCLA, and a key investigator at the Goodman Luskin Microbiome Center at UCLA. Dr. Fulcher completed her MD PhD degrees at UCLA, then completed internal medicine residency and infectious disease fellowship training. Her postdoctoral research training focused on mucosal immunology in HIV, which led to an interest in the gut microbiome. Her current research focuses on some fascinating aspects of how viruses interact with our gut microbiome. For example, she's studying the effects of HIV and substance use on the gut and oral microbiomes, and has shown that methamphetamine can exacerbate inflammatory microbiome changes in persons living with HIV. Recently, her group published a study identifying specific microbiome changes that may increase the risk of HIV. She has ongoing projects investigating how the oral microbiome contributes to inflammation and gut dysbiosis in people with HIV, how bile acids may affect inflammation, and mechanisms of inflammation in people with HIV who use methamphetamines. Her research is supported by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Doris Duke Foundation, and the California HIV Research Program. Welcome to the show, Jennifer. Can't wait to talk to you about some very interesting topics that we've never really mentioned before. And starting with one, so you have various research interests. I think we're going to start with one that has to do with interactions of the gut microbiome with the viruses, with the virome. If you could just say a few things about, like, general things about what we know today about the role of the viruses in the gut microbiome and why they're so important and getting surprisingly little attention, I would say, compared to the bacterial players.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, first of all. I think what I study mostly is how the commensal bacteria and the gut microbiome affect when we get infected with a pathogenic virus. So not necessarily a commensal virus, but a pathogenic virus. And that really goes back to how important the microbiome is for determining your immune system, basically. So it really tunes from the moment you're born and you start developing your microbiome, which you get from breastfeeding, from birth, from your mother, and so forth. That really develops your immune system. So as your microbiome develops, your immune system develops along with it. And there's lots of data, related to that, showing that different microbes and different microbiomes can actually affect risk for things like allergy and asthma and atopic disease and things like that. And so, your microbiome, because it is so important for your immune system and your immunity and how kind of triggered your immune system can be in a good way and a bad way. Your microbiome spends your whole life distinguishing between what should be there and what shouldn't be there. And as the microbiome changes, the immune system has to change with it. And so as it does that, it can either be overstimulated or it can be more fine-tuned. So when you then get an infection, so a viral infection, for example, how your immune system reacts to that really determines kind of how sick one gets.
So we're talking about the gut microbiome, and when viral infections could be any virus that affects the respiratory system.
Exactly. So what's really interesting there's lots of associations between the gut microbiome and upper respiratory infections. So there was a study fairly recently that showed in a mouse model that different bacteria, specifically segmented filamentous bacteria, actually influence the susceptibility of these mice to influenza. And as well, I believe they looked at RSV and SARS-CoV-2 as well. And what they were able to do in the study was actually go all the way to show that it was affecting the alveolar macrophages. So the immune cells that live in the gut were affected by or that live in the lungs were affected by the bacteria in the gut. How exactly that communication is happening isn't quite understood, but the bacteria that live in your gut are going to affect how your immune system works throughout your body, including resident immune cells that live in your lungs, that live in the brain, that can live all throughout the body. And so the bacteria in your gut really affect your susceptibility and your disease with infections at sites outside of the gut, which is really, really fascinating.
This also brings in this component that so whatever affects you, so there's a lot of studies, a lot of interest in the factors that can modulate, either improve or worsen the quality, diversity, and the richness of the microbiome. So all these factors then ultimately can have an influence, an indirect influence on any infection that you might be vulnerable to or resilient to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and again, it kind of goes back to the immune system. So a healthier microbiome tends to have an immune system that is more able to kind of tone itself down when it needs to. So what causes a lot of severe disease, particularly in upper respiratory infections, but other infections as well, is an overwhelming immune response. So I think we learned that very clearly with COVID-19. The reason people with SARS-CoV-2 who progressed to severe COVID-19 got there is because of this overwhelming immune response they had that just overwhelmed their lungs and so forth. And that's how they got really sick. And so your microbiome is really important in teaching your immune system when to start, what to fight, and when to back down. And so if you have a lot of inflammation, so a lot of kind of overactive immune response, that can lead to more severe infection. So in that sense, when you can keep your microbiome healthy, you can help reduce that inflammation and that kind of overactive immune response, and that can lessen your risk of severe viral infections if you were to get a viral infection.
Yeah, just one quick comment. I do remember, and there's still a lot of this on social media that people always talk about. This is good to boost your immune system. It's actually
Yeah.
you want to regulate it, you want to down regulate it or keep it.
Yeah. So I think there is kind of this interest, and I get this from patients that I see in the clinic and so forth about like, what can I take to make my immune system stronger? And unfortunately, there's no like one thing that we can do that. And in some ways, a too strong immune system is a bad thing. But I think gut health in general will quote unquote, strengthen your immune system in that it will be able to respond appropriately when it needs to. And it won't be so kind of over responsive to things that you have this chronic ongoing inflammation, which, is relevant outside of infection. So this chronic ongoing inflammation is one of the main things that contributes to a lot of non-communicable diseases. And so what I mean by that are things like diabetes and obesity is a very inflammatory state, and things like that. And so that's one of the reasons that those non-communicable diseases were so linked again with severe COVID-19. It all relates kind of back to this inflammation and inflammatory state that can increase your risk for severe infections as well as these other non-communicable diseases.
And do we know what the biological mechanisms are that form the connection between the microbial composition and this engagement of the immune system? Is that some of the anti-inflammatory molecules that microbes produce as
Yeah, so it's a lot of different things. And so the answer of do we know is yes and no. So we know some things, but I'm certain there are many things that we don't understand. What we do know is that certain microbes in the gut can definitely kind of train immune cells, like I mentioned earlier with that study, can even train immune cells in different sites. The microbes also produce They can produce short chain fatty acids, which can influence immune cells. There's also just direct interactions between microbes and immune cells via pathogen receptors and things like that that can trigger the immune cells. The immune cells then produce a lot of cytokines, which can then act throughout the body, including up in the brain, on other, peripheral immune sites, induce a lot of inflammation that way. So there's also microbial peptides that can be produced. So there's lots and lots of different mechanisms by which the microbes and the immune system talk to each other, because they're basically, at this interface next to each other. And so they're constantly communicating and interacting. And so how that response gets tuned is really kind of what determines how your immune system will respond in general.
Yeah, it is remarkable that something like this was not really discovered until a few years ago, even though it seems to be the most important interface that we have
Yeah.
with the environment.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? I mean, your gut is probably more exposed to the environment than anything else, and so it makes sense that that would be kind of the training ground, if you will, for your immune cells and where they develop. And I think another thing that's not always appreciated is how much of your immune system lives in the gut. About 80% of your total body lymphocytes, so your white blood cells, your immune cells, actually live in the gut. They don't live in the blood. There are a lot in other secondary lymphoid organs, but the gut is actually the largest lymphoid organ in the body. And so it does, if you kind of think about it that way, it makes total sense that, what is then in the gut is going to be very important for training those cells.
And then thinking about all these, these various factors that have been identified. I mean, we don't know what percentage they contribute to, to the overall risk and resilience, but all these factors from, dietary competition, standard American diet, but then also, micro and nanoplastics. And I mean, so many things that we're not just ingesting food, we're ingesting a whole range of compounds and molecules that we don't even know what they do. But they have been increasing, and
Absolutely.
good things have been decreasing. So it's pretty no surprise that we see, for example, this increase in that at young and younger age, people develop many of these chronic diseases. I mean, like in IBD or cancer or metabolic syndrome, there seem to be the age of these diseases, or colon cancer, seems to be, decreasing progressively. And I think this crucial role of the interface between the microbes and the immune system probably plays the key role in this, even though, we don't exactly understand yet how. And it's pretty no surprise. I mean, it's interesting. One of the hottest topics on social media is gut health, which
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
me as a gastroenterologist, having started, focusing on things like peptic ulcer disease and diseases that you can see with an endoscope and do some pretty dramatic things like surgeries and, doing truncal or cutting out half of the stomach, how this has changed. And it's also always interesting to me how it's not necessarily the scientists that have moved that interest. It's sort of a lot of, I would say, often poorly qualified people that come up with these ideas and concepts. The leaky gut was a good example of this. My patients told me about this like more than 10 years ago, and I totally dismissed it. I said there's no science behind it. But now, so this concept of gut health is definitely a crucial factor in our overall health, not just for digestion, but more for metabolism and immune function.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it helps regulate kind of everything. I mean, there's also interesting data that shows that, crosstalk between the microbes and immune cells can actually interact with the brain via either the vagus nerve or cytokines that actually, travel all the way to the brain, get through the blood-brain barrier. And that can contribute to even the way we feel when we get sick with a viral infection or something. So the feelings of either fatigue or malaise or changes in appetite, a lot of those things are regulated via cytokines or other neurotransmitters that go from the gut via the immune system up to the brain and so forth. So it really is kind of remarkable how critical it is. And I will say, I agree, it's been, you know, people are much more aware of it now. So I'm an infectious disease physician, which means I treat people with infections, all infections, including bacterial infections. So I, prescribe antibiotics and so forth when they're indicated. And even in my career, I've seen a shift between people kind of wanting antibiotics, thinking they're going to fix everything, to people being very cautious about antibiotics and very concerned about what the antibiotics are going to do to their microbiome and their gut health, and really understanding that there's a role for antibiotics when indicated, but antibiotics certainly can cause a lot of harm if used too long or too frequently, or when they're not needed. And so it's been a real shift that I've seen in the past few years of people really appreciating how important it is to maintain their good gut health in order to help treat infections, as well as reduce other diseases, and also just feel better. People feel a lot better. A lot of people, when they finish a course of antibiotics, or when they're on the antibiotics, they don't feel well, and I think a lot of that is because of there's some side effects just from the drugs, but I think a lot of it is because their microbiome has shifted while they're on antibiotics, because the antibiotics they don't know what a good bacteria versus a bad bacteria is. The antibiotics just kill all the bacteria. So, it causes a shift, and people will notice that they feel different when they're on them. And luckily, the microbiome is fairly resilient. And in many instances, to most instances, will kind of revert back to where it was before when people are off the antibiotics. But I think people are really more attuned to kind of how those shifts make them feel.
Let me switch a little bit or home into something that you have published on, some really seminal papers. And this is the whole role of the gut microbiome in HIV infections. So the correlation between gut dysbiosis and, for example, and inflammatory blood markers that are associated with HIV and even precede HIV. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so this is a really, really interesting field that's really taken off, in the past probably decade or so. And when people started looking more at how the microbiome, may be associated with different disease states and so forth, and different infections, people started looking a lot at how the microbiome may change in the context of HIV. And so what was observed is that there were characteristic differences in people living with HIV compared to people who did not have HIV. And so for a long time, there was a lot of interest in better defining what those differences were. There's a lot of data to suggest that some of these changes in the microbiome also contribute to the chronic inflammation that people living with HIV have as well. So we have amazing antiretroviral drugs these days, and we're able to very, very effectively control HIV in that we can stop the replication. People living with HIV can be completely undetectable of virus in their blood. When they take their medication and are undetectable, they actually cannot transmit to someone else, which is remarkable. But despite all of this, they still have this chronic low-level inflammation that continues, and that over time can contribute to an increased risk of other non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, renal disease, certain malignancies, things like that. And so this inflammation is a really important thing. And there have been studies that suggest that certain microbes, either through translocation or other immune mechanisms, contribute to this inflammation. So there's a lot of interest in this microbiome shift that occurs over the course of HIV. But there was always this question about, when does this occur and why does this occur? And these are very difficult questions to answer, particularly in the context of HIV, because for HIV, we don't have kind of an ideal animal model or other way to study it. And it's, it can be challenging to study in humans as well. So we were able to, through a couple cohort studies that I'm involved with, obtain specimens from people who were involved in a study, and while in the study, they acquired HIV. So we had samples from them before they acquired HIV and after. And so we looked at the microbiome in those persons compared to persons who are similar in lifestyle and so forth, who did not acquire HIV. And what we found is that a lot of the microbiome changes that had been attributed to HIV previously were actually existing prior to the acquisition of HIV. So the people who ended up acquiring HIV had a different microbiome than the people who did not. And so there was another study published around the same time as ours that found a similar finding, actually down to the specific bacteria that were the same, in a completely different cohort with different demographics, different race and ethnicity composition, and so forth. And so there's now this real interest in how these microbes in this microbiome may contribute to one's susceptibility to acquiring HIV, rather than just being a change that is observed after HIV. So I think there are both things that occur. I think that there are pre-existing differences in the microbiome that may contribute to one's susceptibility to HIV. And I also think that there are changes that occur over time after one acquires HIV that may further affect the microbiome and again contribute to inflammation. So I think it's kind of, shifted to not just something that happens that after, but that your microbiome before can also affect, your susceptibility to HIV and potentially disease trajectory and so forth.
And this same concept or the same connection might apply to other viral infections, or like COVID-19, for example.
Yeah. So there have been a lot of people that have been looking at the microbiome and see if that can predict people who went on to develop severe COVID-19 or who died from COVID-19. And there are some studies to suggest that there are specific microbiome differences that may be able to predict COVID-19 severity or risk of severe COVID. And they tend to be things that correlate, again, with these kind of metabolic syndrome, inflammatory state. So changes in the microbiome that go along with that also seem to predict COVID-19 severity as well. But absolutely, I think, what you're again, going back to the immune link, what your microbiome composition is going to kind of regulate your immune system and train your immune system. And if that's, kind of not optimally healthy, you may be more susceptible to some of these infections than someone else.
So this, obviously, when you think about it, I mean, we all know that, we will have future pandemics. This was not, COVID-19 was not the only one. Like all this discussion that we have has a lot of implications for that. And do you think the medical system or the public health system is actually doing enough on that front? I mean, there's a lot of investigations and research on the actual offending viruses,
Yeah.
but not so much on the resilience of individuals that might be affected by this virus. Do you think there's enough being done on that topic?
I mean, I think they're different. So I think there's a couple of things. I think, in terms of public health and so forth, what their real role is more, at least the way I see it, is more in surveillance and preparedness. So doing more surveillance for, emerging viruses or catching pandemics at the early stages and being prepared and so forth. The medical research, I think, can be more focused on how do we identify the people who are most at risk and things like that. And I think there is a lot of interest in that. And, there's becoming more and more interest in now that we kind of appreciate the role of the microbiome in this, how do we potentially manipulate that or use that to our benefit to reduce the risk in some of these people. So I do think that there's a lot of interest in that. Another area that the microbiome is really important that, again, I think there's increasing interest in is in vaccine responses.
Mm.
So there are data that suggests that, certain microbiome compositions may be associated with better responses to certain vaccines. And where that's really, really been shown and is really important is in low and middle income countries where, vaccine coverage or vaccine responses are not always as high as in higher income countries. And so what is the reason for that? because it's the same vaccine basically. And so there have been some studies that suggest that there's, microbiome links that may be associated with children and adults and so forth who don't respond as well to a certain vaccine. And can we, maybe use the microbiome to help boost the response of vaccine to reduce, these preventable diseases in these low and middle income countries.
When you say low income countries, does that apply also to the low income segments of the US population? I mean, do they have
Yeah,
a
that's a great question. That I don't know that literature as well, so I can't say that I can quote those studies off the top of my head. But I would imagine that those studies have been done, and that there certainly could be links. I think a lot of the focus has been in other countries just because the contrast in serum response to vaccines is so striking between a lot of higher income countries and low and middle income countries. But I think that certainly looking at at lower income areas within our own country would be important. And I think that there's definitely microbiome differences potentially related to diet and access to healthy foods and things like that, that also, again, contribute to the increase in non-communicable diseases in a lot of children in lower income areas, like childhood obesity and earlier onset diabetes and things like that.
Yeah, listening to you talking about these topics, it almost makes me realize, I mean, this may be the most important aspect of microbiome research and impact of all the different, there's obesity, obviously, there's metabolic syndrome, but with these interactions with the immune system and the consequences for getting deadly infections, I mean, that's almost and it seems to be so obvious now,
Yeah, right.
the research.
Yeah, yeah. It seems, yes, it it does seem so obvious now. But I think, the other thing to think about is, our tools to study the microbiome didn't exist before, so a lot of what we use to study the microbiome right now, at least in terms of identifying what bacteria are there, are these, next generation, more advanced sequencing methods that were not available even when I was in graduate school. This type of sequencing and so forth was not in existence. And so I think that kind of advent of this ability to do this incredibly deep sequencing and identify and profile all these different microbes has really, launched this whole field. And yeah, looking back now, it seems so obvious, but I think we just didn't have the ability to know what all was there and kind of what these associations may be. And so the big push now is there's a ton of studies out there associating different microbiome with different diseases and so forth. And so I think there's a big, need and interest in identifying what of these associations actually are causal and what are these mechanisms, because certainly some associations can just be associations, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those two things are causally linked. There may be some other mediator in there. And so I think getting more at these mechanistic and causal relationships will be really important if we want to translate a lot of this information into, therapeutic uses and interventions and things like that, to reduce, either better treat these infections or reduce the risk of infections and things like that.
So we talked a lot about the gut microbiome. You also published a paper on the role of the oral microbiome.
Yes,
For example,
yeah.
in HIV-associated inflammation. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think, the gut gets all the attention, right? As it should. It's got the most bacteria, but I think the role of the oral microbiome is an interesting one. And if you look back, in literature, there have been associations with the oral bacteria and different states of health for even predating kind of this interest in the gut microbiome. So, it's long been known that certain oral bacteria are associated with dental cavities and other oral health, but also there have been a lot of links between certain oral bacteria and cardiovascular risk. And if you actually dig through the literature, there's a lot of associations between certain oral bacteria and lots of different inflammatory diseases like rheumatologic disease, autoimmune disease, things like that. The other thing that's kind of interesting is when you look at a lot of the associations between diseases and so forth, and even gut bacteria, the bacteria that they're associated with in the gut are often things that we think of as more oral bacteria. And so why are these then showing up in the gut? Does that, you know, transition of oral bacteria then residing in the gut, does that contribute to this disease state? Or is that just a signal of something else? Because a lot of the bacteria that live in the mouth are a little more aerotolerant. So they can tolerate a little more oxygen than some of the bacteria that live deep in the gut that are very, very strictly anaerobic. And when there's more inflammation in the gut, there can be a little more oxygen because the barrier breaks down a little bit. And so does that then allow some of these oral bacteria to grow? And then we see that in the microbiome composition, and that's more of a signal of some inflammation that has led to a state, or do those bacteria show up and actually cause that and change that and then, you know, lead to whatever disease? So I think that kind of dynamic between the oral and the gut microbiome is really interesting. And there are some studies that suggest that, you know, the bacteria can migrate from the mouth to the gut and so forth, and even in healthy states. And so I think that kind of connection is one that's very interesting. And then, you know, just like your gut bacteria can translate to the systemic circulation, your oral bacteria can do the same. And a lot of those bacteria, you know, have very long LPS molecules and can be quite inflammatory in that sense. So, you know, the translocation of your oral bacteria also can contribute to inflammation. And we've done a couple studies linking certain oral bacteria to cytokines and so forth in people with HIV. And so we think that the oral bacteria, similar to the gut, you know, can contribute to chronic inflammation in people with HIV.
So this will be translocation of oral bacteria into the systemic circulation, or do they first have to go into the gut and then being translocated in the gut?
So it's a good question that we don't know. Yeah, I don't, there's no, or we have not done studies, I should say, to basically tell which way it goes. You know, there are certain bacteria that certainly can break down the barrier in the mouth, so that epithelial barrier in the mouth. So certainly there's access to the systemic circulation that way, but they also can translocate to the gut and then get into systemic circulation that way. And so, you know, it's hard to say exactly which way things are going. We have an ongoing study where we're trying to really use very high depth sequencing to track bacteria between the oral and the gut samples over time in people with HIV. So we're hoping to see if we can identify, you know, if this migration is occurring, and if it does, when, and how does that relate to inflammation and so forth, to see if we can kind of tease this out a little better using human clinical samples.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, still a lot of work to be done to
So much work to be done.
Well, let me get to a topic. It's not your primary area of interest, but I still find it sort of interesting. So moving away from these viral infections, but so the possible role of the gut microbiome in substance use disorders.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people would say that abuse of certain substances would actually affect your microbiome. Is it the other way around as well, or which one is dominant? I think you published something on alcohol use disorder and the gut microbiome. Do you want to say a few words about that relationship?
Yeah. So I have a trainee who's working on the alcohol use disorder and the gut microbiome. Dr. Erica Groden has expertise in that area. And so she has a project looking at how the microbiome associates with alcohol use disorder, and also how that may affect activity in the brain using functional MRI imaging. So that there's a lot of data that associates certain bacteria with alcohol use disorder, including some, you know, small interventions where they have looked at, you know, I can't remember if it was probiotics or an FMT to affect cravings and so forth in alcohol use disorder, and also looked at how the microbiome changed when people with alcohol use disorder stopped drinking after a period of abstinence, and found that there were shifts in the microbiome and that these also associate with inflammation. So I think there's a lot of link there. But also in other substance use disorders, there have been a lot of associations with opioid use disorder. And what my research has included is also a look at stimulant use. So methamphetamine use can be particularly prevalent in people with HIV. And unlike some other drugs, it has a specific interaction with HIV that we don't fully understand, that people who use methamphetamines and have HIV have a more difficult time controlling their virus, so staying suppressed. They have an increased risk of medical comorbidities such as cardiovascular disease and so forth. And this is even in the setting of antiretroviral therapy. And so we have looked at how methamphetamine use even kind of exacerbates changes in the microbiome that are associated with HIV. So there's some changes that are associated with HIV, and then in people with HIV who use methamphetamine, there's even additional microbiome changes that are associated with inflammation. And so we think that the addition of methamphetamine may further kind of exacerbate some of these changes. We don't have longitudinal data to know kind of which came first, to your chicken and egg question. But there definitely seems to be some interaction there in terms of inflammation. But there's also, kind of taking a step back, there's, lots and lots of data, in mouse models and so forth, about how certain microbes affect just brain circuitry in terms of reward system and things like that. So, there's, studies in germ-free mice where they don't develop the same kind of reward response, or they have heightened HPA axis responses and things like that. And so with that, there's a lot of reason to think that there could be microbiome links that may predispose somebody to, to develop, addiction and substance use disorder, even before the changes that could occur from the drug itself.
Yeah, and since you mentioned this may not be just focused on one particular disorder. So food addiction is another one that
Absolutely.
people
Yeah.
in our center have sort of provided
Yeah.
evidence. I mean, unfortunately, in many of these studies, most of the human studies are always associations. It's not causation.
Exactly. And that's the hard thing. And, that's, we don't do mouse work in my lab. It's just not my area of expertise. And so we do a lot of associations. Luckily, with longitudinal studies, we can get a little stronger associations, but they're still, not the mechanistic causal studies that you can get in other models. So we are limited in that sense. But like you mentioned, the data with obesity is really amazing. And a lot of that work has come out of UCLA and the amazing people we have here.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of those mechanisms associations are probably very similar to what occurs in the setting of substance use disorder, that I think the addiction physiology may be very similar.
Yeah, since I mentioned UCLA, I can't help to sort of do some PR for the Goodman Luskin Microbiome Center at
Absolutely.
UCLA, where you're a key investigator, and that's certainly I think for the future, will make UCLA a real powerhouse in many aspects of this research, and particularly the interaction then with the future Institute on immune function.
The immunotherapy.
It's
Yeah.
it's a very exciting time,
It
where
really is. It really is. And before I became a part of the Goodman Luskin Microbiome Center, I didn't know some of the research that was actually happening here, just in the building next door and so forth. And so I have very different expertise than a lot of people in the center. And so I have learned a ton from them in terms of a lot of these neural mechanisms and imaging and things like that, that I can then bring to my research and kind of take that in a different direction and to a next level. And so I think that kind of bringing people from so many different departments and disciplines has really, really been important in kind of allowing all of us to kind of ask bigger questions about what,
Yeah.
the role of the microbiome is.
So, I mean, this has been a fascinating conversation. I sort of want to end with something that's really speculation from your side, but
Mhm.
from your own research, what implications for microbiome targeted treatments do you see becoming, actionable within the next, let's say, 5 years? Are there major therapeutic changes, or are we basically just saying we all have to eat a healthier diet, or do you think there's going to be more specific interventions targeted at the microbiome?
I think there's a lot of interest in more targeted interventions. I mean, obviously the diet, is so important in overall shifting the microbiome. And so, in the end, that may be kind of the most powerful intervention, even though, sometimes it can be hard because sometimes the healthy food is not always as delicious as the
Mhm.
cake and cookies and so forth. But I think in terms of targeted intervention, in my area where there's been a lot of interest is how can we use microbiome therapeutics to address this chronic inflammation in people with HIV. And so there's been a lot of studies looking at probiotics, studies looking at fecal microbial transplant or FMT. And so I think there's still a lot of interest in that. I think as we hopefully, now that we recognize that there may be a role of the microbiome even before HIV acquisition, are there ways that we could use probiotics or something more targeted to affect somebody's risk? So not for prevention. I think that would be a little bit of a lofty goal. And we have actually outstanding biomedical HIV prevention tools right now with pre-exposure prophylaxis, which now can be done with injections that people can get every 2 months or even the newer one twice a year. But how can we overall, reduce somebody's risk of kind of inflammation, and then that translates to risk of certain infections and risk of other diseases. So there's a lot of interest in that. And I think as we understand more, we can better target these interventions and hopefully see more clinical benefit. Because I think right now, a lot of the studies have not been as overwhelming as I think people hoped, but there's so much heterogeneity in probiotics and how they're produced and what is given, and what is given for one person may not be the correct thing for another person. And so it sometimes can be hard to see like a big clinical response in something that may need to be very, very individualized.
So I think with this optimistic note, this is a good way to close our conversation. It was absolutely fascinating. I have to say, I find
Thank you so much. Yes.
thanks for taking the time, and I hope that our audience finds it as fascinating as I do. It's really been great to talk to you about this, and I'm looking forward to repeat this in a few years and see
Yeah.
how much of the predictions.
That's true. That's a great idea. Yeah, we should see how much we've advanced at that point.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks so much.